I'd like to start with an opening question, as we do. Is there a story behind a name in your family, either your own first or last name, or your parents' name, or the name that you chose for a child that you would like to share with the group?
My son Neil was named for Nushka Parenson, who was an older woman who I had met on the kibbutz back when I was in college. I had been during my undergraduate days. I was on a kibbutz for 6 months, and I was very impressed with her spirit.
What was it about her spirit that?
She was really tough. I mean, she was 74 at the time. I think she had just broken her knee like 3 weeks before, and she was already walking around on it. And I mean, just I think, and I mean, she knew 4 languages. She was a really amazing woman. Had been one of the pioneers, had come to the kibbutz and helped to drain the swamps and everything back in the early 20s.
Interesting. Janet, I think I saw you signal.
Well, this isn't as positive a story. When my daughter was born, she took my last name, which was very offensive to my in-laws. And my husband is a junior, and I think I didn't realize the importance of their name to them.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Janet. Yes, Merle, please.
Okay. I never really liked my first name because it's a name that could be male or female, and I didn't like that. My names I never had a choice in. I was born Wolofsky. I married a Frankel, and in those days you took on your husband's name. I got divorced, and then I had a choice of whether to keep the name or go back to my maiden name, and I kept the name because I was working and I was known professionally as Mel Frankel. And then I remarried, and when I remarried, I didn't want to take on my new husband's name for sure, and I went back to my maiden name. So I've never really had a choice. But then I joined the Reconstruction Shul in Montreal, and I had my first Aliyah. And my first Aliyah calls me up by my Hebrew name, which is Miriam Esther Bat Meir B'Fredel. Meir means those who give light, and Fredel means joy. So I like my Hebrew name best of all because I'm the daughter of light and joy.
Wow, which you bring every week to Torah study.
Correct.
Amanda.
So when I was born, my parents had a hard time deciding my first name, but for my middle name, my father was okay with my mom just giving me the middle name Perry. It had no real meaning behind it. She just liked how it sounded. And it turned out in the end that it was an uncle of my father's that he ended up thinking that I had been named for him, which I wasn't. But the funny story about it is that I ended up pursuing English literature, and there's a person in American literature studies named Perry Miller, who is a very big deal, and like The Handmaid's Tale is dedicated to him. He like founded the field of American studies. And so when I went to graduate school, and later I was talking to my advisor who had sat on the admissions committee, I found out that not part of the reason, but they had all thought that I was related somehow to Perry Miller. They thought I was like some American literature legacy, and I was not.
Wow, I love this. Unanticipated benefits. That's interesting. And have you grown to love the name, middle name?
Yeah, I really didn't like it when I was a kid. I think kind of similar to Merle, I don't know, it didn't seem like a real name. I didn't know anyone named Perry. But as I've gotten older, I really like it.
Wonderful. Nancy and then Annette.
There's nothing particularly interesting about my name, but my partner's name is Jamil. His parents are from Baghdad, and he had an uncle who was dating a Muslim woman, and there must have been some tension in both families, and he was murdered. And after he was murdered, every boy that was born was named Jamil. So Jamil has two cousins who have the exact same name as him. It's kind of wild.
Wow. And Jamil and I share Iraqi heritage. And in fact, my uncle ended up having some part to play in Jamil's family story.
That's right. Actually, your uncle took the place of Uncle Jamil in Japan.
Yeah.
When Uncle Jamil moved back to Baghdad, your
Yeah.
uncle took his place.
My uncle Victor. Okay, Annette.
When my mother was pregnant with me, my father had an aunt who died. So my Hebrew name is her name. I think her English name may have been Anne, and my mother didn't like the name Anne. So I got the name Annette, which I always hated, and I thought was incredibly pretentious for a Jewish girl's name, and didn't go with Jacob's. But when I became an adult, my father's sister, who did not like my mother, nobody in my father's family liked my mother, and my mother didn't like my father's family, told me that I was really named after the woman my father really loved, which was his best friend's wife, whose name was Annette.
Oh my
And
God.
I have no idea if that story is true. I do know that his best friend's wife, his best friend at the time, wife's name was Annette.
Oh my God. So
Oh
this-
my God, yeah.
Wow. And it's not a bell you can unring.
No, it's very burdensome. I've made my peace with it. But
All right. Well, we'll have to come up with a Torah nickname for you. Well, and what's your Hebrew name that you said you like?
oh, I hate that too. It's Hinda.
That's Hinda is from the Bible, is from the Tanakh. My mom's name is Hinda. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
I hate it. So
Sorry.
I hate both my names. My
Wow.
parents did not do well by me.
Make another one. Choose a different one. The middle name.
Well, that seems, I thought about that, but that seems disrespectful of my parents.
I
And,
have a-
and my poor great aunt who died young. I mean, she was only in her 40s or something when she died.
Hmm. Does anyone else want to add a story? Yes, Claudia.
My last name, clearly not a Jewish name, and yet I'm Ashkenazic Jewish on both sides. This story, and I'm not sure I believe all of this. So both of my grandfathers came as draft dodgers back then. If you got drafted as a Jew in Eastern Europe and in the Pale, you were in for, I think, 25 years. So my father's father came in at 18 under the passport of a boy who had died, a false passport. The story is that he came to the port of immigration and tried to explain that the name on the passport was not his real name. His real name was Arsht, and that the immigration officer didn't speak Yiddish, Arsht, difficult name. He had written on a piece of paper to go to Chicago to stay with a man named J.J. Harris. And Harris we have been ever since. And I could not relate to this name. Annette, I also did not like either of my names. But I couldn't relate to it until finally I went to the Isle of Harris, which is in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. And I loved that island. So now I have a connection to that name. Harris, by the way, means son of Harry or Harold. My father's name was Harold, so he was Harold, son of Harold. I don't think he ever knew that, though.
Anyone else?
I have a story about my name.
Yes.
I was living in India, and I was taking a class, and the teacher asked everyone their names, and everyone there had very long names like Vishnu Devananda and Ramachandra and Bhaktivedanta, and I said, my name is Ed, and he started to laugh because it was so short, and he decided that I needed a longer name, and so he gave me he named me Edaha, which is Ed with a nominative ending on it. So after that, I became known as Edaha to everyone.
Wonderful.
I don't know if it is or not, but that's what happened.
Well, Ed Aha sounds like a man of ideas. Um,
Oh, well, he's a book editor, so that fits.
Yeah, I often, I try to place us in liturgical time. And we are in, I think, kind of fitting with winter, a little bit of a kind of barren stretch of the Hebrew calendar. Cheshvan has a little bit of that. We talked about that earlier. We just finished Hanukkah about 3 weeks ago. And, I think our next thing is Tu B'Shvat. That may take another kind of month to get to, but, we are in this kind of bleak landscape, which is interestingly resonant with where we are in the Torah story, because we are heading into the bleak landscape of Egypt. So the overview of the Parsha, Jacob and his descendants moved down to Egypt, and life starts well in Goshen, living under the benevolent rule of Joseph as second in command to Pharaoh. But that generation and the generation after dies, the new Pharaoh comes on and does not remember Joseph and all the good that Joseph did for the royal treasury and to save Egypt through the famine. Soon they are enslaved. Pharaoh is told a prophecy that a deliverer will be born, prays that all male Jewish boys will be killed. He tries to enlist the two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, in this plot, and through an act of civil disobedience, they do not go along. Moses is born in secret. He's hidden in the house till he's 3 months old and can no longer be safely stowed. His mother puts him in a basket in the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter finds him and adopts him. He grows up privileged in the house of Pharaoh as his adopted son, but he learns of his Hebrew heritage. One day happens upon an Egyptian beating a Israelite slave mercilessly, kills the Egyptian. He thinks he's managed to do that without witnesses, but finds out that there were witnesses. Word gets back to Pharaoh, who threatens to kill Moses, who flees for his life to Midian. In Midian, we have another scene of meeting your beloved by the well. Moses drives off some shepherds who are harassing the daughters of Jethro. They bring him home. He gets a hero's welcome. He courts and marries Zipporah and settles into a shepherd's life in Midian. Until one day God appears to Moses in a burning bush and basically tells Moses that he's going to be the deliverer. Moses protests. God says, he says, I'm heavy of tongue. God says, you won't be alone. Aaron will accompany you to speak truth to power. Moses tries to get consent for the Israelites to have a festival in the desert. And Pharaoh basically makes life worse and makes the Israelites gather the straw that used to be provided to them to make the bricks. And the Israelites complain bitterly at Moses's failed intervention. An incredibly full Parsha, lots going on in it. But we're going to go right to the beginning. And hopefully everybody has a Chumash. I'm not going to be doing much screen sharing today. Does everybody have a Chumash they can turn to Exodus 1:1? Amanda, why don't you just jump in if you can?
Should I read in English or?
English, please. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was about to say my Hebrew is very new and very bad.
Yeah. No problem.
So 1 through 8?
Yes, please.
Okay. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you're the editor of the Bible and you want to get going on the story. Where would you bring out the red pen? Anyone on these 8 sentences? What feels superfluous to the story? That, yes, Claudia.
I first I thought I'd cut out the total number of persons were 70, but that contrasts very nicely with that was a rather small number, and then whoop, they were fertile. So I'm not sure what I would cut out.
Anyone else?
I mean, I guess you could argue unless everyone that is listed plays a big role in the story coming later, maybe you don't need to know all the names of the people that came with their households. So you maybe mention the important people and say along with like other sons of Jacob, or you could just say like all the sons of Jacob and then introduce them as they became important.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like telling the story of the Titanic and, pausing to give the passenger list. It's sort of like, let's just get to Jacob and his sons came down to Egypt. And so the names are a little bit of a diversion. And it's interesting, right? Think about all of the books of the Torah. They all have evocative names. And the first substantive word really kind of talks about the subject matter of the book. You have Genesis, Breshit, and it's like the beginning of it all, beginning of the world, beginning of the Jewish people. You have Vayikra, Leviticus. Now that's a little bit more obscure. It means calling, but it is sort of God's call to us through the commandments and how we are spoken to. Bamidbar is the wilderness, and that's basically 40 years of wandering through the desert. And Devarim, which is words, is a collection of speeches, right? And it's Moses recapping what happened since the deliverance to the edge of the promised land. And Deuteronomy means second telling. So they all work except Shemot, names. And so it does feel like a diversion. And so I guess the question is why with the names? Merle, go ahead.
Well, it said that the reason God remembered the people in Egypt is because they stuck to their Hebrew names. Names are very important in Judaism. If you think of Yad Vashem, which is the memorial to the Holocaust, it's a memorial to names. So names seem to have a great power.
Yes, I think that that's a wonderful point. And in fact, the stories that you told at the beginning speak to the power of names, right? Names as legacy, names as things to sort of grow into, things that, are part of self-definition, later, names of inspiration. So names are important. One of the commentators, Or Chaim, says that the names are to honor them. And it's a very interesting commentary he gives to say these people are to be honored because they knew they were going down to Egypt to submit to 200 years of slavery. You had to really believe in the ultimate promise to do that. Rashi notes this first sentence, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. Almost the exact sentence is stated in Genesis 46, 8-9. And Rashi says, it enumerates all of these people again. We hear about them when they came down and enumerates them again on their death, thus showing how dear they were to God, that they are compared to the stars. And that was, back in Genesis where the promise is made to the patriarchs, the stars, which God also brings out and brings in by number and name when they cease to shine. There's two things in there. One, there is a coming and going. And when in Genesis, it's described, here are the 70 people that went down, that was contemporary narrative. By the time you hit Exodus, it's history. And these are now forefathers that you're looking back on with all of the weight of, oh, this was my great uncle, Simeon who came down. And so that layering across generations becomes, of much greater significance. But I think Rashi's point also about stars appearing, reappearing is kind of a beautiful statement with regard to both the arc of a life from the beginning to end and honoring a name which over the course of a lifetime really comes to signify so much. but also the stars sort of come out daily, as do we. So there's kind of an interesting question as to the person who shows up tomorrow, what's their relationship to the you who you are today? And that is, there's some evolution and there's some continuity at the same time. And very much names recognizing individuality. And the whole issue of naming, like, there is an initial instance of naming in the Torah that happens in Genesis. Does anybody know the first significant instance of naming?
The animals, right?
Yes, Adam. Adam names all the animals. There's a beautiful midrash about how Adam was able to see through to the essence of each of the animals and sort of come up with their name. That was, in fact, the spark of the divine within him, that he was able to do it. And I think about that in particular as we name children, and what you're hoping to sort of convey to children. I thought, Ken, your story about the woman that Neil was named for, I'm sure there was part of you that wanted to infuse that spirit into your young son. Another interesting take on the names. So verse 7 says the Israelites were fertile and prolific. This is the JPS translation. They multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. If you go to the Hebrew, it says Uvenei Yisrael, the children of Israel, Paru, so pari is like fruit, so that's fruitful. Vayishritzu. So what's that word vayishritzu? I think that word was translated to kind of multiplied, but does anybody have a different translation for vayishritzu?
Prolific,
Increased,
multiplied.
mine was, says increased abundantly
Increased
and multiplied.
I'm looking at, I read online, and one says more literally they swarmed. A
perfect.
word used of the prolificness of reptiles.
Exactly. Vayishritzu, if you go back to the 5th day of creation, when the swarming creatures are first created, that's the word sheretz that's used. And the word swarmed in that is actually a negative. And there's a commentator, Sforno, this was highlighted by Aviva Zornberg, who's wonderful if you read her work. He says Vayishritzu, swarmed. He goes back to Genesis 1:20, and Sforno says, after the last of the original 70 migrants had died, their whole lifestyle became more like that of creeping insects, creatures headed for destruction. And so the names of the founders are to be contrasted with the namelessness of the descendants as they swarmed. It's a little bit justifying Pharaoh's hatred of them, and so it's interesting to hear one of the commentators go in that direction. But that, there you have it. Yes, Merle.
It sounds like some of the people in this country are talking about the immigrants who are swarming across the border.
What,
You know,
perfect.
They're going to take away our jobs. They're going to, it sounds like the same mindset.
This is Steve Bannon's retelling of Genesis.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
Exodus.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
or drawing on it.
That's a
Drawing
beautiful
on it
connection.
to justify what he's doing now.
Perfect connection. You're exactly right. It's that otherizing and
And
dehumanizing
fear.
and
Fear
fear.
that these people are going to overtake us.
Yes.
You know, we're not going to, you have this happening all over the world where people are wanting to hold on to their culture by, by keeping immigrants out.
Yes.
There's also a note in mine that says it maybe implies they bore 6 children at one birth. That's just what the note says. And that makes them seem, kind of going back to what you were saying, almost like subhuman or something not quite human.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that abundance, which is in some ways a blessing, is a threat. Yes, Claudia.
My question is, why might so many of the translations, including mine, have in some way tamped down that word? Mine is increased very greatly. So might the translators into English have been afraid of those implications that you're unpacking Or, I mean, it's spin control, but why?
Yeah, I think you're right. Because one narrative is that this was, a blessed multiplication that incubated the mighty nation of Israel, that then, gets to leave in triumph. And then the other is maybe a story of assimilation, right? And that the Israelites brought it upon themselves in a way. And that there are some negative aspects of the narrative. And you can see the commentators tussling with it a little bit. Claudia, I think you're right to point to the struggle between the commentators.
What I found it is, because this happens a lot, that you've got to watch out for the darn translators. I mean,
There are no unique translations. It is a marker to say here's where we need to dig in and maybe formulate our own view. Let's go to chapter 2. And Nancy, is your mic working now?
Yes, a certain member of the house of Levi went and took into his household as a wife a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him.
Anybody want to comment on these 4 verses in light of what we read in chapter 1?
Well, again, there's no names.
No names.
It's a certain member and a woman, a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and they don't tell you what that son's name is.
Why is the approach to names so different between chapter 1 and chapter 2?
Well, maybe obviously they're under threat at this point, so it's kind of a way of still hiding them in some ways.
Okay. So they are engaged in a sense in an illegal act in giving birth and hiding this Hebrew child in a violation of the decree.
Maybe they weren't as individuated. And so the house that you're from is sort of more important than who you are as an individual.
That is a really perceptive comment. And it begs the question, what's the significance of being from the house of Levi? And we're going to just pause there for 1 second. What's the first story that involves Levi?
The revenge for Dinah.
Revenge for Dinah. Levi and Shimon together, right, slaughter the entire town of Shechem as a revenge. So if the significant point here that the narrative wants to dwell on is that they're from the house of Levi, what are they implying about what Moses is channeling, right? Is it a certain fierceness? And does that resonate at all with the narrative of Moses?
Yes,
Where?
Moses had a temper problem. He kills the Egyptian, strikes the stone. I mean, there are a lot of things that he does. He definitely has a temper problem.
Yes. Well, so a very good connection, Merle. And not only that, but I'll just note that the word that's used in the narrative when Moses strikes down the Egyptian is the word bayach, to hit. And that is the same word that's used when Moses strikes the rock in frustration because talking to it is not sufficient. So Moses definitely has an anger management problem. Obviously, a person of great virtue, but that's one thing in the theme. And, Levi is symbolic of that. I'll mention just one other thing. I mean, the absence of names for his 2 parents is in a way symbolic to the fact that he didn't know them. Right. And so it's a way a little bit of erasing them from the narrative. Ramban, Nachmanides says, we're going to dispense with the names. We want to get right to Moses. And it's a way of emphasizing the star of the show. You have to wait to chapter 6 actually to hear who his parents are. And I'm going to share the screen. Here's Levi. Levi has Gershon, Kehat, and he also had a daughter, Yocheved. Okay. Look where Amram, Moses' father, is. Yocheved is the mother. Amram is the grandson of Levi. Amram married his aunt, Yocheved.
Hmm.
When the laws are finally given, probably somewhere in Leviticus where all this stuff is, marrying your aunt is prohibited. And so some of the commentators are saying this is a little bit of an erasure of an unseemly relationship. And that's why they're not mentioned at the time at the beginning of the narrative. But I want to go to one last thing about the most important name of the book. Amanda, I think you were saying earlier that we don't get Moses's name, but we do get it finally in verse 10. And so the story which picks up in verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile. While her maidens walked along the Nile, she spied a basket amongst the reeds, sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water." What is curious about verse 10?
Yeah, I don't get that. How does that Moshe, what does that mean? I don't.
Well, Joanne?
Now, my understanding is that this name really relates to Ramses, Ra-Mazes. In Egyptian, it's the king of light, but she leaves off the Ra part. And that's that she's giving it a name, a royal name she's giving to this infant.
Oh, that's so interesting. So the Masses part of Ramses.
Yes, that's a royal honorific, right?
That's
And that's
very
what she's
interesting.
giving this child.
Huh.
I have
All right,
a.
thank you for that. Go ahead. Yes, Merle.
I have a commentary. Moses, Moshe, is here associated with the word mashach, to dry out, which represents an assonance rather than the correct etymology. The rabbis overcame the linguistic problem. Drawn out should be mashoi, which means Moshe, he who draws out, by suggesting that he was given the name phonetically, in that Moses would draw out Israel from Egypt, or that Moses drew himself out, so to speak, because of his merits. The wordplay is repeated in Isaiah.
So this is beautiful. And it's basically saying that just as Moses was drawn out of the Nile, Moses would draw the Jewish people out of the Nile. But can I just take us back to 1 second? If there is a decree from her father that all Jewish boys be killed, what is she doing naming the child a Jewish name?
Well,
It's
apparently,
an Egyptian name.
That's
Well,
why I
it-
think it's not a Jewish name. That's precisely why I think that she gave him an Egyptian name, but we have reinterpreted it as Jews do. But that's where I stand, so.
Well, you know, so Joanne, I hear you, and I think the point that you are taking is well taken, because the name Moses itself doesn't necessarily say that. But explaining, "I drew him out of the water," right, bringing it back to Hebrew word roots, right, as opposed to royal honorific, does raise the question of what's going on here.
By the way,
Go ahead.
I have another comment. More likely, Moses was an Egyptian name signifying born of, as in Pharaoh Tutmon Moses, born of Tut. Perhaps there was originally an Egyptian prefix to the name, which Pharaoh's daughter gave him, but this is later omitted in the Jewish tradition, and the Hebrew assonance was introduced. Egyptian sources also seem to note an independent name, Mose, Mose. A 13th century BCE papyrus speaks of Aman Opet, son of the steward Mose, and in a stele of the same age notes a priest, Aser, son of Mose.
Let me thank you for giving us that history, and I think the name is definitely resonant, and I think this echoes with Joanne's comment. 2 things, and then I want to go to one last story. And one is, when it says she named him Moses, she is not identified. So maybe it was Pharaoh's daughter, maybe it was Yocheved. So it's not clear who the she is. And then also, explaining "I drew him out of the water" may not have been public. So one of the commentators basically says that this was kind of the side note recognizing the Jewish heritage, but she knew not to be public about that. But the name, because as Joanne is telling us, is potentially resonant of the royal honorific, who's to know? So there is a little bit of a mystery packed in verse 10. I want to close with one story. This story begins about 100 years ago in a small town in Georgia, where Mike King was born to a family of plantation sharecroppers in 1899. And as a youth, he developed an interest in preaching, initially practicing eulogies on the family's chickens. At age 19, Mike left the rural farm behind after accusing the owner of cheating his father out of money. He landed in the big city, determined to remake himself. With his third grade education, he launched himself as a preacher in small churches. He boarded with a prominent local minister, courting his daughter for 8 years until she consented to marry him. His in-laws encouraged him to finish his education. He enrolled at Morehouse College and received his ministry degree at age 33. When his father-in-law died, he became pastor of one of the largest churches in the city and soon became a prominent figure locally. In the summer of 1934, Mike's church sent him on a whirlwind trip to Rome, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, ending in Berlin, where he would attend the Baptist World Alliance meeting. The trip to Germany had a profound effect on him. Adolf Hitler had become chancellor the year before. All around him in Berlin, Mike saw the rise of Nazi Germany. The Baptist Alliance responded to that hatred with a resolution deploring, quote, all racial animosity and every form of oppression or unfair discrimination towards the Jews, toward colored people, or toward subject races in any part of the world. Mike was deeply impressed by the history of the country, where in 1517, the German monk and theologian Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, challenging the Catholic Church. The act would lead to the Protestant Reformation, the revolution that would split Western Christianity. When Mike King returned home to the Ebenezer Baptist Church in August 1934, he was a different man. It was sometime in this year that he changed his name and changed his 5-year-old son's name too. For Mike King, who had come to Atlanta fresh off the farm, the switch to Martin Luther King, the words of one writer, caught the feeling of his leap to the stars. The act was almost biblical in its transformative nature. Taylor Branch wrote, Jacob became Israel, Saul of Tarsus became Paul, Simon became Peter. Interestingly, the younger Reverend King initially shrank from this new name and only began to use it in his late 20s, where we have a letter in which he uses it to his wife, Coretta. According to Branch, he commented publicly only once after the Montgomery bus boycott that perhaps he had finally earned the name Martin Luther King Jr. So that is a surprising story that resonates with the service that some of you are about to go to and the holiday we celebrate and the man we honor on Monday. And for me, seeing this name acting to elevate both this man and his son, each man ultimately growing into that name and fulfilling its promise. For me, it shows the power of naming, the power of a name to transform, inspire, and define. And so circling back to the earlier question, why do we begin the Parsha with names? We see in this story how naming can be an act of creation. And what is the book of Exodus if not the story of creation of a nation? It is from those named at the beginning who followed their destiny, even into slavery, that a great nation would emerge. These would not be the names on a transport list to bondage, but rather the founders of a great and enduring people. Having pondered the meaning of names in our portion and in our lives, we keep in mind the stories of our ancestors if we know them, the names bestowed upon us or that we bestow or adopt, and the hopes and dreams packed into those names, sometimes seeking continuity with the past and sometimes seeking to put it behind us, and how each name is tied to the unique soul created in God's image. Shabbat Shalom.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Shabbat shalom.
Well,
Shabbat
thank you.
shalom, everyone.
Wonderful to study with you.
Next,
To
we're
meet you.
looking forward to the next time.
Okay.
Bye. Shabbat
Bye-bye.
shalom.